The early mist coiled low over the rugged peaks of the Blue Ridge Highlands, where 16-year-old Avery Morgan moved like a shadow through the dense underbrush. To most, this forest was wild and intimidating, but to Avery, it was home. Its rustling leaves, its babbling brooks, and every trail worn into the soil were as familiar as her own heartbeat. Raised by her father, Ethan Morgan, a veteran park ranger, Avery had spent her childhood learning to read the signs of nature, cracked branches that told of passing deer, the silence that warned of nearby predators, the sweet scent of damp moss signaling fresh rain. But today, something felt off. The forest wasn't just quiet, it was still, in a way that made her skin prickle. As they hiked the southern ridge, a sudden sound cut through the silence, a high-pitched, frantic cry, unnatural and terrified. Avery froze, her breath catching. That wasn't a bird. That wasn't any sound she'd ever heard echo through these woods. Her father's eyes met hers, already alert. Without a word, they broke into a careful run, weaving between the towering oaks. The cry came again, desperate and near. Whatever was out there was in danger and needed them. What they were about to find, neither of them could have expected, because this wasn't just any wildlife encounter. It would be the beginning of something wild, something unforgettable, a bond born of courage, compassion, and the fight to save a life that would one day change Avery's forever. The cry pierced the woods again, sharper this time, frantic. Avery's boots thudded against the damp forest floor as she and her father raced toward the sound. The trees thinned into a clearing, and what they saw made Avery's blood run cold. A man in camouflage hunched over a writhing canvas sack, muttering curses under his breath. The sack thrashed violently. Whatever was inside was terrified. Then it hit her. A cub. A bear cub. Its muffled cries were high and panicked, the fabric smeared with dirt and tiny claw marks. "Hey!" Ethan's voice boomed like a rifle shot. The man froze, startled, then spun around. His face twisted into a sneer as his eyes locked onto them. "Walk away," he growled, one hand resting on the hilt of a hunting knife. Avery stepped forward, heart racing. "That's a protected species," she said, voice shaking but strong. "You're on government land. We've already called for backup." It was a bluff, no signal out here, but she didn't blink. The poacher's eyes flicked between them, weighing the odds. The paws stretched like a wire. Then, with a frustrated snarl, he dropped the sack and bolted into the woods. Avery didn't move, couldn't, until the sound of crashing branches faded into silence. Then she was kneeling beside the sack, hands trembling as she untied the knot. Inside, a tiny black bear cub blinked up at her, its body trembling, eyes wide with terror. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're safe now." And in that moment, Avery knew this rescue was only the beginning. The cub was barely moving. Its tiny chest heaved in shallow, broken breaths as Avery gently peeled back the canvas sack. Matted fur clung to its sides, speckled with dirt and flecks of dried blood. One of its paws was scraped raw, and its hind leg trembled as it tried to stand, only to collapse again. "We need to get him warm," Avery said, urgency rising in her voice. Ethan nodded grimly and shrugged off his jacket, wrapping the cub carefully. Together, they hurried back to their cabin, nestled deep within the heart of the Blue Ridge Highlands. By the time they arrived, the cub had grown limp in Avery's arms. They transformed the mudroom into a makeshift wildlife recovery space, spreading out sleeping bags, heating water bottles, and dimming the lights to keep the cub calm. Avery knelt beside him, gently dripping warm formula into his mouth using a syringe. "Hang in there, little guy," she murmured. He blinked up at her with glassy eyes, vulnerable but alive. Later that night, as Avery sat beside him, watching the rise and fall of his breathing, she whispered, "Shadow." Her father looked over. "What?" She smiled faintly, running her fingers through the soft black fur. "That's his name. He's been through darkness, but he's still here." Ethan said nothing, but nodded in quiet approval. Shadow. The name clung to the room like a promise. Avery didn't know what came next, but she knew she wasn't letting him face it alone. The wild had taken its first swing, and she was ready to fight back. The first few days were fragile. The cub, now named Shadow, barely moved, curled into the soft folds of an old blanket near the fireplace in their cabin. His breaths came slow and shallow, eyes flickering with fear every time someone entered the room. Avery stayed close, whispering gentle words, offering small drops of warm milk through a syringe. Shadow would flinch, recoil, but never growl. He was scared, but somewhere beneath the fear, he was trying to trust. Ethan kept his distance at first, letting Avery lead. She read aloud to Shadow at night, her voice soft and steady, until one evening, he lifted his head and let out a soft huff, almost a sigh. That small gesture sent Avery's heart soaring. It was the first sign he recognized her not as a threat, but as safety. By the end of the week, he was lapping from a shallow bowl, his tiny claws scratching at the edges. A few more days, and he followed Avery clumsily across the living room, tumbling over rugs and bumping into her boots. Wherever she went, he trailed, curious, cautious, but determined. Every step Shadow took was a victory, every wobble a testament to his will to survive. Avery documented his progress with her old camera, each click preserving a moment in time, a sleepy yawn, a curious sniff, the way he leaned against her leg with growing trust. In this quiet cabin deep in the Highlands, a bond was forming, one of healing, of hope, and of something wilder than either of them could yet understand. Within a few weeks, Shadow was exploring every corner of the Morgan cabin with renewed energy. But Avery and her father knew the comfort of four walls wasn't where a black bear belonged. It was time to start preparing him for the wild. Ethan transformed the fenced backyard into a mini wilderness, logs for climbing, piles of leaves and branches for foraging practice, and hidden berries and nuts for Shadow to sniff out. Avery would sit just outside the fence each morning, camera in hand, documenting every paw step, every shaky climb. Shadow stumbled at first, his instincts dulled by trauma, but Avery encouraged him with gentle words and proud claps. Slowly, he began to trust the soil beneath his paws. He climbed, dug, sniffed, and pawed at fallen logs like the cub he was meant to be. When he wrestled with a hanging rope Ethan had rigged between trees, Avery laughed, snapping photos as his fur tangled and his spirit soared. The images she shared online began to attract attention. What started as a simple photo journal turned into something bigger. Comments flooded in, questions about poaching, offers to donate, messages from wildlife lovers around the world. Shadow's journey was no longer just Avery's, it had become a symbol. But as his strength returned, so did a flicker of reality in Avery's chest. Every leap he landed, every tree he climbed, brought them one step closer to goodbye. Because training him for freedom meant preparing her own heart for the hardest part of all, letting go. The crisp air of early fall clung to Avery's skin as she stood beside the open transport crate, her heart thudding like distant thunder. Shadow, no longer the trembling cub from that sack, but a strong, healthy black bear, stood at the edge of freedom, his dark eyes scanning the wild expanse of the Blue Ridge forest before him. Around them, the forest was alive with wind and whispering leaves. But in Avery's chest, a stillness settled, an ache she hadn't prepared for. For weeks, she had trained him for this. She had watched him scale logs, sniff out hidden berries, wrestle old tree stumps like they were rivals. She had done everything right. But nothing had prepared her for the look he gave her now, half curious, half knowing, as if he could sense the weight of her goodbye. Ethan touched her shoulder gently. "He's ready," he said. Avery nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. With one slow breath, she stepped back. Shadow glanced at her one last time, the forest light catching in his eyes. Then, with a deep huff, he turned and stepped forward, his powerful legs carrying him into the trees. No hesitation, no fear, just purpose. Avery's eyes blurred as she watched him vanish, the underbrush parting for his path, then stilling like he'd never been there. But he had. And he always would. Somewhere in that vast wilderness, a part of her was running free beside him. And with that truth, she finally let him go. The silence in the cabin was deafening. For the first time in months, there were no soft paw steps trailing Avery down the hall, no low huffs from beneath the table where Shadow used to nap, just stillness and the hollow echo of goodbye. Avery sat curled on the worn porch bench, her camera cradled in her lap, the lens cap still off, as if waiting for a moment that had already passed. She had taken hundreds of photos, Shadow chasing falling leaves, climbing the log structure Ethan had built, curling against her boots under the stars. Each image now felt like a relic. But Shadow's absence wasn't just a loss, it was a shift, a weight that settled in her chest like fog on the mountain. She couldn't sleep, couldn't stop glancing toward the woods, expecting to see him emerge from the tree line, as if he'd changed his mind and come home. But wild things don't come back, not if you've done right by them. Still, Avery refused to let the ache consume her. She began editing her footage, writing about their journey, and sharing Shadow's story online. What started as a handful of followers grew into a community, people inspired by the bond between girl and bear. Local schools invited her to speak. Wildlife groups reached out. Shadow was gone, but his legacy was taking root. And in that growing chorus of voices calling for protection, Avery found something she didn't expect: purpose. Shadow had left the forest stronger, and he'd done the same for her. The wind carried a strange stillness that afternoon, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Avery wandered the familiar trail behind their cabin, her boots crunching softly against the frost-bitten earth. Winter had begun to creep into the Blue Ridge Highlands, coating every branch in silver and muffling the sounds of the world. She didn't expect anything unusual. This was her way of coping, of reconnecting with the woods that once brought her and Shadow together. But halfway down the ridge, she stopped cold. Fresh tracks. Large, precise, bear tracks. Her breath caught as she knelt beside them. The impressions were recent, pressed deep into the damp soil with a strength she recognized instantly. Her heart thundered. "It can't be," she whispered, fingers tracing the edge of a paw print that was unmistakably his. She stood slowly, eyes scanning the silent trees around her. Then it hit her. A scent. Earthy, familiar. Her breath steamed in the cold air as she turned, following the invisible thread of memory that seemed to pulse through the forest. Just beyond the bend in the trail, a rustle broke the silence. She froze. Nothing. Then, a low huff. Avery's eyes welled as she slowly turned. There, half concealed in the shadows of the pines, stood a black bear. Bigger now, stronger. But those eyes, those deep, intelligent eyes. Shadow. He didn't approach. He didn't need to. With one long, quiet look, he told her everything. He remembered, and just like that, he was gone again. But this time, Avery smiled. Weeks passed in silence. Avery returned to the forest often, her eyes scanning the trees for a glimpse, her heart hoping. Still, Shadow was gone. Or so she thought. Then, one snowy morning, her father burst through the door, laptop in hand. "The trail cam picked something up," he said, breathless. Avery rushed to his side, her fingers trembling as he clicked open the file. The grainy footage loaded slowly, trees swaying gently, snow falling, then movement. A sleek black bear stepped into frame. Bigger now, confident, powerful. But it was the eyes that stole her breath. Deep, knowing, familiar. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Shadow." He moved through the frame with ease, sniffing the camera curiously before lumbering off into the trees. Another clip showed him digging for roots, another climbing a fallen log. Avery watched, tears streaming freely. He wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. Her months of care, every sleepless night, every tear and whispered comfort, it had mattered. Shadow was living the wild life he was meant for. In that moment, Avery felt something inside her settle. He had remembered the forest, and the forest had remembered him. And now, thanks to her, he was exactly where he belonged. The forest was cloaked in snow, a frozen hush blanketing the Blue Ridge Highlands as winter settled deep into its bones. Avery trudged alongside her father through a narrow, pine-lined trail, their boots crunching in unison. Ethan had said nothing specific, only that she needed to see something. When they reached a rise overlooking a quiet clearing, he stopped and pointed. "Look there." Avery followed his gaze, her breath catching. A large black bear stood at the edge of the trees. Her heart pounded. It was him, Shadow. His sleek coat shimmered under the pale sun, muscles rippling as he moved with quiet grace. But he wasn't alone. A smaller bear, a female, stood close beside him, her gaze alert but calm. Avery's throat tightened. Shadow had grown into a wild, majestic creature, strong, confident, free, and yet... He paused, his head turned toward the ridge, his dark eyes locking onto hers across the clearing. The look held no fear, only recognition, a quiet thank you, a goodbye. Then with a soft grunt, he turned and melted back into the trees, his companion close behind. Avery stood motionless, tears prickling her eyes. He remembered, and now he was no longer just surviving, he was thriving, exactly where he was meant to be. Some bonds are too wild to cage, too pure to forget. Avery's journey with Shadow wasn't just about rescuing a cub. It was about learning what it truly means to love something enough to let it go. She gave him a second chance at life, and in return, he gave her a purpose that would ripple far beyond the forest. Love isn't always about holding on. It's about giving space to grow, even when it hurts. And when Shadow turned one last time before disappearing into the trees, Avery understood. She had done something extraordinary. She hadn't just saved a bear, she had set him free. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of the power of compassion, please don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more powerful wildlife stories. Until next time, stay wild, stay kind, and always listen to the call of the forest.